In this interview, our executive director sits down with John Skiles Skinner, a writer and political activist, to discuss his efforts in advocating for women's and LGBTQ rights. John shares the story behind creating the website FamilyPolicyFoundation.org, which he uses to critique and expose the agenda of the Family Policy Alliance, an organization that seeks to restrict these rights. Additionally, John talks about his vital role as an escort at abortion clinics, where he helps women safely access abortion services while shielding them from harassment by protesters.
So there are two legally distinct entities, Family Policy Alliance and Foundation. There's no real attempt made to distinguish those different names. It reminds me a little bit of like companies that make tobacco and then they get sued because they cause lung cancer and they keep
Mhm.
changing their names because frankly, they don't really want to be known for the work that they do. I suspect that organizations like this choose intentionally confusing names that are difficult to remember.
So they're trying to fool people. So they're supposed to be, on one hand, moral, virtuous people, and on the other hand, they're engaged in some sort of chicanery.
That's what I think. The two organizations they have different tax statuses, and one of them faces fewer lobbying restrictions than the other.
Mhm.
So essentially, the point of one of them is so that they can lobby and not face the scrutiny from the IRS that an organization would face if it had a more favorable tax status, right? So it's like they're trying to both get donations in a tax favorable way and
Mhm.
also to lobby the government on public policy.
So were you surprised that the Family Policy Alliance sued you for this website?
Yes, I was surprised. I think it's maybe not technically a lawsuit, it's arbitration. They took
Mhm.
my domain name to WIPO, which stands for the World Intellectual Property Organization,
Mhm.
and they wanted to seize the domain name and thus take down the website. They claimed that me making a website with their organization's name .org was a trademark violation. And I must admit I was not keenly aware
Mhm.
that WIPO was an entity you could appeal to. It's part of the United Nations. It's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. I
Mhm.
did not expect to see my name on a piece of international case law, but now I do.
How did you argue the case from your side?
We made a free speech argument and we made an argument that the trademark that they were claiming was actually not very strong. And the panel, basically the judges
Mhm.
who saw our case, didn't even touch our free speech argument because they thought that the trademark that the Family Policy Foundation held was actually so weak that the Family Policy Foundation had no grounds to make the case. They dismissed the case with prejudice. They said, get out of here. You don't have a real trademark. Stop hassling this guy. The Family Policy Alliance is actually part of Focus on the Family. It's a part of a
Mhm.
big media empire that has a bunch of different little brand names that have intentionally evasive names. They don't use their name all over their media empire.
Well, I was impressed you knew who the Family Policy Alliance, who they were, because not many people do. What first brought them to your attention?
I'm originally from Nebraska, and I was doing local politics and local activism in Nebraska, and I particularly on queer issues. And I found that my biggest opponent was an organization called the Nebraska Family Alliance.
Mhm.
I really didn't know about them. And it turns out that they're part of a nationwide network of similar small organizations. They exist in most of the states in the United States. And then they are this sort of national liaison to them is the Family Policy Alliance. So I became very keenly interested in this central organization from which all this policy that's bad policy for women and queer people comes down to the state level.
And they also, as you just mentioned, are very anti-LGBTQ. We were following them because they had put on their site a therapist, Jason Graves, who had lost his license in Colorado because he allegedly harmed a client. He abused them, is what they said when he took his license away. And most people don't know how anti-gay they are, but I mean, this is really a feature. They're promoting this whole pray away to gay nonsense.
Most of the pro-conversion therapy legalization
Mhm.
stuff that's happened at the state level in most states in the United States is ultimately through this group. It's through the state level family policy councils. They essentially don't think that gay people really exist or really ought to exist. So they want to like wish them away with conversion therapy, even though it doesn't work. They don't want them to get married. They don't want them to be able to adopt children. They don't want them to have workplace protections, everything like that.
You became familiar with the religious right and their underlying motives by being an escort at an abortion clinic in Nebraska. And you saw the way women were harassed when they came into the clinic. Describe that experience and how it impacted you.
The reason that escorts, like I was at that time, exist is because the clinic, when it's offering abortions, is surrounded by anti-abortion protesters who, of course, they hold signs and they march around. They also try to block the entrance to the clinic as much as they can get away with. They try to basically test the property lines and test the security of the clinic as much as they can get away with. They try to create difficulties for all the patients who are coming into the clinic. For clinic staff, they would identify people who worked at the clinic and approach them outside of work, knock on their front door at their house, go up to them at church, that kind of thing, and basically hassle them about working at an abortion clinic. So essentially everything they could think of to make life difficult for everybody associated with the place.
Yeah, and they even had a fake a house that they tried to make look like a clinic and to lure women into their clutches so they wouldn't go into the women's reproductive health clinic. So it was kind of like a bait and switch.
Yeah, they would wave cars that were clearly trying to drive into Planned Parenthood, into the fake clinic house instead. It was kind of dressed to look up like a plausible seeming health facility. Like people there wore scrubs to give the impression that they provided some kind of medical services, which they absolutely do not do.
That's I mean, they call themselves fundamentalist Christians, but here they are breaking one of the commandments. I mean, they're literally lying to women to persuade them not to have an abortion. And there was also this really interesting situation you wrote about in a Washington Post op-ed about your experience, where the clinic would have to keep building a higher and higher wall, and the anti-abortion activist would build higher and higher platforms to yell at the people going into the clinic.
They would yell like, you don't have to do this, don't kill your baby, or that kind of thing to patients who are going into the clinic. And yeah, there was a process of escalation where they would build a higher yelling platform and Planned Parenthood build a higher wall. I didn't include it in the article, but we also had a leaf blower that we would use to create sound to drown out the yelling. So there was also escalation, in the sounds as well. It was kind of like a little bit of a little war, right? Like people are always trying to figure out a new strategy.
And it's certainly escalated right now. Roe v. Wade's been
Yeah.
overturned by the right-wing Supreme Court. We just had the Arizona Supreme Court bring women back into the 1800s with their law. We just saw Alabama with IVF, that fight going on. So they're not being quite upfront, the anti-abortion movement, when they're saying it's just about abortion. It's something much broader than this, isn't it?
Absolutely. I heard from the anti-abortion protesters, they were always trying to talk me and talk the other escorts and clinic staff out of doing what they were doing. We were not allowed to respond to them, so they just said whatever came into their heads basically to try that they thought would be persuasive to us. And very often they told us about their whole worldview where they think that abortion wouldn't be necessary if people just had like basically virtuous Christian sex lives, and also birth control wouldn't be necessary. They were very much against birth control.
Well, how could you say that's pro-life? We'd all die from boredom. But anyway, I digress.
It didn't make any sense as pro-life, right? Because how exactly are condoms related to abortion, right? Like condoms don't kill babies. It doesn't make sense. But to them, it made sense because a lot of people, what they're really in there for is a whole Christian worldview. I think they want dominion over human, not only reproduction, but all human sexuality, human sexual expression, and gender expression.
And you wrote a great op-ed in the Washington Post, one of the best I've read about that. And you said people essentially better watch out, because if they're given an opportunity, they will take over every aspect of society in terms of socially, and dictate how people live their lives.
Now that I've been through the experience of having the Family Policy Alliance attempt to take down my website that was critical of them, I find it increasingly ironic that the Family Policy Alliance promotes itself as a free speech advocacy organization.
Mhm.
They on their own website, they talk about freedom of speech for website creators who refuse to create wedding websites for gay couples. And there's some cake decorator that wouldn't make a cake for a gay wedding.
Mm.
They love to promote those free speech topics as long as they are about conservative Christians controlling your sex life.
Help us fight ex-gay lies. Truth Wins Out monitors, researches, and exposes the ex-gay conversion industry. Support us and learn more at truthwinsout.org.